you about basically two options that we're faced with, and that is pulpit or participation. And I'd like to go into some aspects of how we function as church and consider some perspectives that perhaps will open our eyes to some real problems that we've been facing for a long time. In 1965, I started my believing journey, and I started hearing sermons actually in 1964, and so I started off going to Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, so I was hearing quite a bit of what we would call sermons. And then in 1975, we moved to Nashville, and in 1976, a brother named Ken Larry asked if he and I could go through a book together, and about our third meeting, he asked me a question. Now, the reason he asked me the question is because he came to our little group that was meeting in Norbert's home in the basement, and he came and visited once. So anyway, after we began reading this book, he asked me, John, why do you have a podium up in front where you are? And he said, why don't you just sit, with the rest of the people? And I was a little, annoyed at his question, and I said, well, the Lord says that He'll save those that believe through preaching. And he said, yes, but preaching is an activity in the New Testament that is outside the body, a proclaiming of Jesus to the outsiders in the world. And so, I was a little irritated with his question, but it stuck with me. And I started looking at the New Testament and what it taught about preaching. And I came to the conclusion that he was right, that preaching was primarily an activity that was outside the meetings of the body, and it was directed toward unbelievers, and that the words used in the context of the believers were mutual words rather than just a proclamation to others. So that began my journey way back in '76 there to think about these kind of things. And so I'd like to explore this whole thing about this, what we call the centrality of preaching, and ask if maybe we're not missing some very important things about our learning of Jesus and Him flowing through us and many related areas, that by exalting the pulpit in our way of doing church, we're actually missing some very important elements of the life of Christ flowing through people in the body. And so we're going to explore some of those things in the course of our talk today. So let's back up a little bit and think about something that would undergird anything that will be said, and that is that we know from Ephesians that God has an eternal purpose in His Son, Jesus Christ. And Paul specifically says several things about that purpose in Ephesians. One is that His goal was to bring Jew and Gentile, male and female, bond and free, into one new humanity through the cross. And the other thing is that Ephesians 3:10 says that He wants, through the body of Christ, to show His manifold wisdom in this age. So that's God's purpose. His purpose is to obtain a bride for His Son who will express Jesus together. And so His purpose is to display something through His body, which is on earth, while Jesus physically is at the right hand of God. So that undergirds everything we were talking about, because we're not just in a vacuum, we're in the flow of His eternal purpose in His Son. And so when we talk about preaching and body life and that kind of thing, the assumption is that are we in line with His eternal purpose in His Son? That's really what it's all about. And so when we think of John 14, when Jesus is telling them that He's going to be leaving, he says to them that you're not going to be orphans. I will come to you. And that phrase doesn't refer to the final glorious coming of Jesus. It refers to his coming on the day of Pentecost to the body of Christ. And so you've got Peter saying on that day, this is that which is he has poured forth this, which you see and hear. So this was an activity of Jesus that was happening on the day of Pentecost with those 120 men and women. And so the most repeated promise in the New Testament is regarding John and Jesus. John baptized with water, but Jesus will baptize with the Spirit. 7 times that's repeated in the New Testament. So on the day of Pentecost then was the pouring out, the Jesus coming to his body to begin his life on earth through his people. And so this is a very important fundamental point that we need to understand, because we tend to think of his second coming as his, the final glorious coming at the end of the age. But we've got to understand that the day of Pentecost was a coming of Jesus Christ to his ecclesia, his body on earth. And so that, again, is an undergirding factor in everything we're going to talk about. And one of the key things Jesus pointed out regarding his coming on the day of Pentecost was in John 7, when he said that those who believe in me, out of their innermost being will flow rivers of living water. And that's a key point that has to be underscored many times. The whole goal of Jesus' redemption in terms of his people was for them to then flow with his life. That's really, where he's at. And he said that the Spirit would be given when he was glorified, and that was in the resurrection. So Jesus was glorified in the resurrection, and then he pours out the Spirit on his body. And so in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul said that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, and the Lord is that Spirit. So in other words, when the Spirit came, Jesus came. And this is the beginning then of Jesus is at the right hand of God, but he continues his life and ministry on earth through his people. And so on the day of Pentecost, Peter announces that this is that. Here's what Joel was talking about, and it's the Spirit being poured out on men and women, both genders. And that's the beginning then of this wonderful expression of Jesus on earth through his people. But what do we find on the day of Pentecost and the days that followed? We see that something rather interesting was happening, because here are these Jews coming from all the nations to Jerusalem for Pentecost, and obviously their whole lives changed as a result of what happened, and so many thousands were baptized. But what does it say happened? They began meeting house to house and eating together with gladness of heart. And also they were outdoors in Solomon's temple hearing the apostles teach of Jesus Christ. So there was sort of an outdoor thing going on, and then they were meeting house to house and eating together. So isn't it interesting that right away, here they are beginning the life of Christ. And of course, they didn't understand a lot of things, but they're beginning the life of Christ. And what do? They don't build a church building. They don't look for a pastor. They just begin to share the life of Christ together in Jerusalem, door to door, house to house. And there was tremendous joy and gladness, and many wonderful things were taking place. So nobody had to tell them. They didn't have a course on how to meet in a home or anything like that. It was just the Lord's life in them led them to this display, to this way of life. And so you see right away this whole point of they were meeting not in a religious building, but they were meeting house to house. And so that's just sort of the pattern that came out right away. So that's important, because again, down the pike, years later, the church became more and more institutionalized and more rituals going on and, more leaders and all that. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the point being, when it first started, it was life. Everything that was happening was because of the life that was flowing out of those people. It was not a program. It was not an organized thing. Let's get this going and get that going. No, the Lord was just leading and directing, and it was just a beautiful thing. And of course, naturally, unfortunately, it didn't last for a long, long time, but that's the way it began. And so then when we have a little glimpse of a meeting of the believers in 1 Corinthians 14, which is the biggest window we have of a gathering, then what do we find? Well, obviously there were some problems Paul is correcting, but he describes a meeting that what we would have to call is open. Everyone was participating, and he talks about unbelievers being in their meeting and that they see what's going on and they fall on their face and say, God is in your midst. So something was going on there that was very striking. And then later in verse 26, he says, each one of you has a song, a teaching, a tongue, an interpretation. Let all things be done for edifying. And so what you have is a description of a gathering where there's nobody up front, there's no platform, because more than likely they were in a home. And so they were in a larger domicile, probably in a living room, and were configured there. And so when they were, and also in the context, they ate together. So eating together and having a meeting together, we find that the perspective that Paul gives is each one of you has. So it was not a meeting of the few, it was a meeting of the many. And so it doesn't mean everybody had to talk every time they got together. It just means that there was an atmosphere where anybody could share something that the Spirit was putting on their hearts. So that's the general glimpse that we have of the New Testament gatherings of the saints. Unfortunately, then, we want to look at what happened later. So in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the influence of Greek and Roman practices and philosophy came into the visible church and infected it terribly. And so we could look at many, many issues, but the one issue I want to focus on today is the idea of preaching. This is the origin of the sermon. You don't find sermons, in the New Testament. It's wrong to call what Jesus taught in Matthew 5 through 7 the Sermon on the Mount. You see, that's bringing our idea of a sermon into what he did. That wasn't a sermon. He was teaching people in a natural setting when he did that. And people call what Peter did in Acts 2 as a sermon. They say Peter's sermon. That wasn't a sermon. Again, he was outdoors and he was proclaiming it to his fellow people, the Jews, and he told them what was going on here. So again, to bring our idea of a sermon into the New Testament is unnatural. It's just not the same, and we need to remember that. So where did the sermon come from? It came from the influx of Greek and Roman ideas into the visible church. So you have to appreciate a twofold development. One was the bishop. By 200 AD, there was more and more focus on a bishop who had a territorial influence. So he was like over, a handful of churches or whatever it was, and he was like the focus. He became the focus more and more. And so statements were made like, if you submit to the bishop, you're submitting to God. So there was that close relationship to the leader and the Lord. And if you didn't submit to the leader, then you weren't submitting to the Lord. So it was getting very, very much astray. But my main point right now is the idea of these leaders who are becoming more and more powerful, taking on the activity of a homily or a sermon, and they would then speak to the congregation, and it became more and more, institutionalized and a form, very formal and here's what you do, when you do it, and all that. So that's the origin of what we call preaching. That it wasn't in the New Testament. It was in the post-apostolic times when the sermon became more and more of a focal point given by the leader, the bishop or whoever it was. And so we have to appreciate that we're so used to hearing, we need a sermon, we need a sermon. But we need to remember there's nothing about sermons by one person in the New Testament. But later in history, it did. It came to be more and more focused on the teaching of one person. So then in the Reformation, when they broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, then the Reformers pushed the sacramental table to the side, and they made the pulpit the center point. And so the focus was on the minister, and then he would give usually a very long sermon to the congregants. And so again, the whole focus of the coming together of what they called the church was the sermon. And sometimes they had an hourglass they kept on the pulpit so that it could be turned over after a long period of time went by. And so this is something we have to underscore. See, there's a big shift from body emphasis in the New Testament, where there's 58 one another's and nothing about one person doing a sermon. And then later, you have the shift toward leaders, and then they're giving sermons. Now, fortunately, there's a wonderful book by David Norrington called To Preach or Not to Preach. And that book does an excellent job of going over the New Testament data, and then it goes over the post-apostolic history and shows how the centrality of the sermon came about. So I would encourage you to check out that book if you'd like to get further into how the sermon appeared and the centrality of it and all of that. So in America, when we think about our history, then you see our country expanding from the east to the west, and so as you look at that, you begin to see a pattern of a focus on preachers, and they're preaching and they're giving sermons. So when the country expanded and churches were built, church buildings were built, then that's the thing, you had preaching. And so that's a long history. And then with Charles Finney and D.L. Moody and ultimately someone like Billy Graham, you have the idea of having many people come around and you have preaching. Now, some of what Billy Graham did would be more in line with what preaching really is, because he was not doing it in a church building so much, but in a larger setting. So in that sense, he was closer to what preaching really is. And so what happened is you have the development of an infrastructure around preaching. So as the years rolled on in our country, you begin to have institutions arise that would train preachers. So the first seminary in the United States, I believe, was somewhere between 1812 and 1830, and then you had more and more seminaries begin to appear as the years rolled on. But anyway, the point being is now you've got a place where people can go and be trained to be preachers, and they can learn how to preach. And then as time goes on, you have books that are published about preaching and how to construct a sermon and all that. And so you've got this whole infrastructure built on the idea that you must have preaching in the way that we define that. And so there were books on how to craft a sermon, and just book upon book upon book. And so there have been quite a few seminaries, quite a few books. And so everyone just assumes, that this is the right thing, and that we need a preacher, we need sermons. But again, we maybe need to step back and ask, why? Do we see that in the New Testament? No. And yet we've built everything on this myth that sermons are central. So most of us in our walk probably have heard hundreds if not thousands of sermons. I know I have. And when you look back over what you've heard, you probably would have to admit that A, you don't remember hardly any of them, and B, there might be a few that impacted you, and C, it took up a lot of time for you to hear all those sermons, but what was accomplished? Were you equipped to do the works of service? Were you truly enabled to begin other ministries and service to people? Or was it basically just coming to hear the pastor give a sermon? And that was basically the point. So we know from sociological analysis that the monologue, which is what a sermon is the worst form of communication. So here we've chosen the worst possible way to communicate to people, which is one person talking and then ending it, and that's it. As our key, we build everything on that. And so is it any wonder that the church has heard millions of sermons, but how much equipping has occurred? How much life has occurred? And the answer would have to be not a lot, because it's basically just going through the motion of what we're expected to do. And then the pastors, the leaders, are expected to have a sermon ready every Sunday for people. And so what does that involve? They have to spend many, many hours constructing a sermon. And then, as we know, many pastors admit that their Saturday nights are often spent in panic, trying to get their sermon put together and all so they can do it, Sunday morning. So again, we just have this whole structure of things built on the idea that when we come into the building, then we're basically there to hear the sermon. We may have a worship team, we may have a lot of other stuff, but the whole crescendo is the sermon. And that's why we're there. But then we have to ask ourselves, honestly, how profitable have all the hundreds and thousands of sermons that we've heard been to us? How have they really matured us? How have they really equipped us? So I think we can see from empirical observation that the centrality of the sermon does not appear to be accomplishing the ends which it is supposed to. So when we think of believers coming into a building, we pretty much can see that it's all about the sermon. It's all about hearing these words. But isn't it tragic if the New Testament revelation shows us that what we have is a body meeting where the focus is on everyone and the focus is on Jesus coming through his people, flowing through the rivers of living water, flowing through his people? That's a whole different paradigm, you see. And so we're used to something that is unnatural. It's not the DNA that is in us, but we have the system that we're pretty much forced into because we don't have other options that we know of. And so we just go through what is told to us. And the bottom line is, it's not about Christ flowing through many, it's about words coming from one. And there's something wrong with that picture, because Paul said, the body is not one part, but many. But if you look at the way most churches function, wouldn't you have to conclude by what you see that the body is one part and not many, if you look at how it's structured and the reality of it? So there's something radically wrong with this whole assumption that this is the way we need to do things. And I think we need to have a radical rethinking of going back to the roots in the New Testament to find out what really is important. So here we've got all these things going on in going to church. And when you boil it all down, the bulk of it is based on myth, not reality of what's in the New Testament. So I think there's, a red flag that should be appearing in our minds and hearts that just something isn't right. The focus, the fulcrum has gone way over to the side of leaders and their speaking. And the whole emphasis in the New Testament on 58 one another's is basically totally lost. We have no sensitivity to what is revealed, and we have sensitivity to what isn't revealed. So I would encourage you to think, about this whole matter. Is there something wrong that we need to maybe open up to and ask the Lord what reality is? So when we look at what preaching is in the New Testament, as I've already sort of alluded to, that it's about proclamation to outsiders, not preaching inside to the body. And for example, we have Noah is called in Peter a preacher, and he's called a preacher of righteousness. But who was he preaching to? He was preaching to those that were, as it were, not on the boat. And so he was preaching to outsiders. So that sort of gives the essence of what preaching is in the New Testament. Not to believers, but to lost, those who are lost and need Jesus. And so it's basically an outdoors activity to reach those who need to hear about Jesus. So there's a big gap, you see. We brought into the church what should be, for the most part, done outdoors, done outside the body. So again, there's a lot of confusion there, you see. And so the idea of preaching is totally misunderstood. There's only one place in the New Testament where it talks about preaching in the body, and that's in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper. And it's interesting, he says, you do proclaim the Lord's coming. And so there is a proclamation, that's a word used for preaching, but it's not one person. It's the body, plural. You do proclaim. So it's a proclamation done by the body. So that's, again, a different story than hearing one person give a sermon. And when we look at Acts 20, verse 7, when Paul was traveling, and it says he came to Troas, and they gathered together to break bread. So there's a statement of why they got together. They did not get together to hear preaching. They got together to break bread. Now, Paul happened to be there that meeting, so naturally, if Paul came to any of our gatherings, we certainly want to give him time to talk to us. So Paul talked a long time, but it's interesting, the word used there is not the words for preaching, it's the word dialogeomai, from which we get the word dialogue. So Paul dialogued with them for a long time. So certainly what Paul said was the backbone of what, they heard, but it isn't a monologue. People could, ask him questions or maybe interrupt him and ask him to clarify something, who knows what. But the point is that it was a dialogue. It was, and granted, Paul's words dominated what was said that evening, but the point being is that it was an open talk. In other words, he wasn't just proclaiming something, pontificating something, and then leaving. They were involved in it. So it's a big difference. But the point being is the text says they did not get together to hear Paul. They got together to break bread. And so I think that again shows that it was a relational meal time. And in the course of all that, then Paul talked to them for a long time. So I think many people talk about, going by the book. And they say that they want to follow the Bible for what it says in their life. So my question is, if we say we want to go by the book, then why do we put all the emphasis on the sermon, for which there's no evidence, proclaimed by one person? There's no evidence of that in the New Testament. And in a building, usually, there's no evidence of that in the New Testament. And so if we want to go by the book, then why wouldn't we start with 1 Corinthians 14 and have an open gathering where people could express Jesus in many, many millions of ways? So we need to maybe evaluate. We say we want to go by the Bible, but so much of what we do isn't even in the Bible. So we've exalted that for which there's no evidence, and we've negated that for which there's evidence, and that is the 58 one another's, which involve relationships in the body. So we've got everything turned around, and yet all the time we're claiming this church goes by the Bible. Well, I think we need to rethink that. I don't know that that's true. So we basically have two models in front of us. The one model is pulpit, and the other model is participation. And the model of participation has basically been painted over and covered up because we've so exalted the pulpit model for which there's no evidence. And so you can see why things might be messed up a lot, is because that which would bring joy and blessing to have Christ's people sharing with each other in openness versus just listening to one person give a monologue, we're missing tremendous blessings by having the wrong emphasis. So I'd like to appeal to those of you who do stand behind pulpits. And I would just like you to consider, in light of what I've said today, if you claim that you're concerned about the New Testament and what it says, have you given proper attention to maybe wondering if maybe our meetings should be looked at differently, and that the whole pulpit-centered model maybe is keeping us from tremendous blessings that Jesus could pour out on us? Remember, the traditions of men are what block the Word of God. They nullify the Word of God. So is it any wonder that a tradition like pulpit-centeredness has blocked the work of the Lord and His people? All of them coming together in an open atmosphere. Instead, we're in a closed atmosphere where we're told, who will speak and when to stand and when to sit. So I think those of you who labor in making sermons and trying to present things to people week by week, I'd really encourage you to step back and ask yourself, is this really where it's at? Or maybe is there something that we need to rethink? And there are plenty of resources like Norrington's book to help you in that journey of rethinking what church really is all about. And to those of you who sit in the pew week after week and listen to sermons, I would encourage you to ask yourself, is this really the fullness of the Lord? Us just coming to a building, singing some songs, putting money in a plate, listening to a worship band, and then hearing a sermon? Is that what Jesus died for? Is that what it's all about? And just think of the beauty of having however number of saints, 10, 30, 50, whatever it is, coming together in openness and letting Him lead, letting the Spirit guide. That's such a wonderful blessing that we're missing by putting all our eggs in the basket of the pulpit. So I'd ask you to consider what the Lord is really pursuing. What is His heart in all of this? And the scary thing is if you think of all the church buildings that exist, if an angel was to come in one Saturday night and take all the pulpits out of all those buildings, and the people were to come the next morning, Sunday morning, and there was no pulpit, what would they do? They're so used to a certain route that to see the pulpit gone, all their first thought would probably be, well, where's the pastor? Who's going to give the sermon or whatever? But you get my point. We're so focused on one thing that we're missing the things that are really vital. And so I would suggest that if we got rid of the pulpits, that then we could have a body meeting where we could share with each other. And of course, people aren't prepared for that because they're not used to it. They're used to being bumps on a log. So it would involve a process of beginning to open up to the Lord and ask Him to show us, Lord, you're the leader. Show us, guide us, direct us, bring out yourself through each one of us, and all the implications of that, which are many. So we're without a model. For the most part, people have no idea that there's a better way. There's a Christ-centered way. All they know is the pulpit model for the most part. And so they're scared They're intimidated. But we've got to ask the Lord to lay that aside and just ask Him to lead us. Ask Him to flow through us. And I believe He'll answer that prayer. And I'd like to say this, that in all that I've been talking about, we can't lose sight of this. What I'm talking about is not, oh, let's meet in homes, or oh, let's have a meal together, things like that. No. We're not talking about a fad. We're not talking about a new way to meet or something. We're talking about Jesus Christ being expressed through His people, where their DNA can flow. That's what we're talking about. And you could do that in a park, you could do it in an apartment, you could do it any number of places. It's not the place. It's the push of the Spirit to let those rivers of living water flow through His people. That's what it's about. It's about Jesus Christ. How does He want us to express Him? And we can know for sure, I think, that He's not interested in one person doing all the expression. He's interested in the body doing the expression. And I think in light of this, we need to totally rethink all our structures and all that we connect with church, because the likelihood is very high that we probably don't have it right. We've probably taken the focus off of Jesus and moved it into a million other things. So I would encourage you to think about these things, take them to the Lord, and ask Him to show you His way.